Captain Sarah Chen stood at attention in the briefing room of Edwards Air Force Base in California, her flight suit crisp and her posture perfect. She had waited 3 years for this moment. 3 years of training, proving herself, and fighting through every doubt thrown her way. Today was supposed to be the day she finally flew as co-pilot on a critical supply mission to a forward operating base. But the look on Captain Derek Hastings' face told her it wasn't going to be that simple. "You've got to be kidding me," Derek said, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. He didn't even bother lowering his voice. "They're assigning you to my flight." Sarah felt every pair of eyes in the briefing room turn toward her. Some looked sympathetic, others looked amused. A few just looked away, uncomfortable with the confrontation but unwilling to step in. She kept her face neutral, refusing to give Derek the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. "Captain Chen is your assigned co-pilot for today's mission," Colonel Matthews said from the front of the room. His tone was firm but tired, like he'd had this conversation before. "Is there a problem, Captain Hastings?" Derek crossed his arms over his chest. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with a kind of confidence that came from being told he was the best since the day he earned his wings. He'd flown combat missions in 3 different countries. He'd landed planes that other pilots said were and he'd never let anyone forget it. "With all due respect, sir," Derek said, though there was no respect in his voice. "I requested Lieutenant Morrison as my co-pilot. He's flown with me a dozen times. We know each other's rhythms. We work well together." "Lieutenant Morrison is on medical leave," Colonel Matthews replied. "Captain Chen is more than qualified." Derek let out a short, bitter laugh. "Qualified on paper, maybe, but this isn't a training exercise, sir. This is a real mission carrying critical supplies to soldiers who are counting on us. I need someone I can trust in that cockpit." The words hit Sarah like a slap. She'd heard variations of this speech her entire career. She wasn't strong enough. She wasn't experienced enough. She didn't belong. It didn't matter that she'd graduated top of her class at flight school. It didn't matter that she'd logged more simulator hours than most pilots twice her age. It didn't matter that she'd grown up in a family of pilots. That she'd been studying aerodynamics since she was 12 years old. That flying wasn't just her job but her calling. To men like Derek Hastings, none of that mattered. All he saw when he looked at her was someone who didn't fit his image of what a pilot should be. "Captain Chen has an exemplary record," Colonel Matthews said. His patience was clearly wearing thin. "Unless you have a legitimate operational concern, she's your co-pilot. That's final." Derek's jaw tightened. For a moment, Sarah thought he might push back further, but he just shook his head and said, "Fine. But when this goes sideways, it's on the record that I objected." He turned and walked out of the briefing room without another word. Sarah stood there, her hands clasped behind her back, trying to ignore the whispers that erupted the moment the door closed behind him. Colonel Matthews caught her eye. "You good, Captain?" Sarah nodded. "Yes, sir." "Don't let Hastings get in your head," the colonel said quietly. "He's a good pilot, but he's also stubborn and set in his ways. Prove yourself up there, and he'll come around." Sarah wanted to believe that, but she'd heard the same promise before, and it rarely worked out that way. Men like Derek didn't come around. They just found new reasons to doubt you. The mission brief was straightforward. They'd be flying a C-130 transport plane loaded with medical supplies, ammunition, and equipment to a base in a remote training area. It was supposed to be a routine flight, 4 hours out and 4 hours back. The weather forecast was clear. No complications expected. Sarah spent the next hour doing her pre-flight checks with meticulous care. She inspected every gauge, every control surface, every system. She reviewed the flight plan 3 times. She checked and double-checked the weather reports. If Derek was looking for an excuse to question her competence, she wasn't going to give him one. When she arrived at the aircraft, Derek was already there, doing his own inspection. He didn't acknowledge her when she approached. He just kept working, moving around the plane with practiced efficiency. "I've completed the internal pre-flight checks," Sarah said. "All systems are green," Derek grunted. "I'll verify that myself." "Of course," Sarah replied evenly. She wasn't going to argue. She wasn't going to get defensive. She was just going to do her job. For the next 20 minutes, Derek rechecked everything Sarah had already checked. She watched him work, noting that he was thorough but also that he wasn't finding any mistakes. Because there weren't any mistakes to find. Finally, he climbed into the cockpit. Sarah followed, settling into the co-pilot seat. The cockpit felt smaller with Derek's hostile presence filling it. He ran through the startup sequence without explaining anything, without coordinating with her the way a pilot and co-pilot normally would. Sarah followed along anyway, monitoring every gauge, every readout, ready to step in if needed. She'd trained for this. She knew this aircraft inside and out. Edwards Tower, this is Cargo 7 requesting clearance for departure, Derek said into his headset. Cargo 7, you are cleared for departure. Runway 27, the tower responded. The engines roared to life. Sarah felt the familiar vibration through the seat, the rumble of power waiting to be unleashed. This was the moment she loved. The moment before flight. The moment when the earth still held you but the sky was calling. Derek taxied to the runway without a word. His hands moved over the controls with confidence, and Sarah had to admit he was smooth. Whatever his flaws as a person, he knew how to fly. They reached the runway. Derek pushed the throttles forward. The C-130 began to roll, slowly at first, then faster, faster, the nose lifting, the ground falling away, and then they were airborne. Sarah watched the altimeter climb. 1,000 feet, 2,000, 5,000. The base grew smaller below them, the California desert stretching out in all directions. Flaps up, Derek said. It was the first thing he'd said to her since they'd taken off. Flaps up, Sarah confirmed, making the adjustment. They climbed to cruising altitude in silence. Derek kept his eyes straight ahead, his jaw set. Sarah monitored the instruments, watching fuel consumption, engine temperature, hydraulic pressure. Everything was normal, but this was going to be a long flight. 2 hours into the flight, the tension in the cockpit hadn't eased. Derek flew with rigid precision, communicating only when absolutely necessary. Sarah responded professionally to every curt instruction, maintaining her composure even as frustration simmered beneath the surface. She'd dealt with men like Derek before. During her first deployment, her commanding officer had refused to let her fly combat missions, insisting she was better suited for transport runs. Never mind that she'd outscored every other pilot in her unit on the combat simulation tests. At her previous base, she'd been excluded from informal flight training sessions, the ones where the experienced pilots shared hard-won knowledge with the younger ones. They'd claimed it wasn't personal, that they just forgot to invite her. But Sarah knew better. She'd learned to swallow her anger, to channel it into becoming better, sharper, more prepared than anyone else. She'd learned that proving herself wasn't a one-time event. It was something she'd have to do over and over again with every new assignment, every new crew, every new mission. The landscape below them had changed from desert to mountains. Sarah checked their position against the flight plan. They were making good time, the weather holding clear, just as predicted. How long have you been at Edwards? Derek asked suddenly. Sarah was so surprised he'd initiated conversation that it took her a moment to respond. 6 months, sir. Where were you before? Ramstein Air Base in Germany. Before that, Joint Base Charleston. Derek nodded slowly. Combat missions. Some, Sarah said carefully. Mostly supply runs into hot zones. Medical evacuations. Ever been shot at? Sarah thought about a night flight over hostile territory. Tracers lighting up the darkness, the sickening lurch of the plane as the pilot threw it into evasive maneuvers. She thought about the wounded soldiers in the cargo bay, their lives depending on her getting them to a field hospital. Yes, she said simply. Derek glanced at her for the first time since takeoff. His expression was unreadable. And I did my job, Sarah replied. We got everyone home safe. He turned back to the windscreen. That's not the same as being in control. Following orders in someone else's cockpit is different from making the calls yourself. There it was. The real issue. Derek didn't just doubt her skills. He doubted her judgment, her ability to lead, her right to sit in the captain's seat. I've logged over 2,000 flight hours, Sarah said, keeping her voice level. 400 of those as pilot. I've flown in sandstorms, through mechanical failures, and in combat zones. I'm not here because of a quota or because someone felt sorry for me. I'm here because I earned it. Derek's jaw tightened. I've seen a lot of pilots who thought they'd earned it, right up until the moment they froze. Have you ever seen me freeze? Sarah asked. I haven't seen you do anything yet. Derek shot back. That's the problem. Sarah took a slow breath. She wouldn't let him bait her into losing her temper. Then I guess you'll just have to wait and see. The conversation died. The cockpit filled again with the steady drone of the engines and the crackle of radio chatter from other aircraft in the area. Sarah went back to monitoring the instruments. Fuel levels were good. Engine performance was solid. They'd be at the drop-off point in less than 2 hours. She thought about the first time she'd ever flown. She'd been 8 years old, sitting in the cockpit of her father's Cessna, her feet barely reaching the pedals. Her father had been a Navy pilot, her grandfather before him. Flying was in her blood, in her bones. She'd never wanted to do anything else. You have to understand something, Sarah, her father had told her when she'd announced she wanted to follow in his footsteps. It's going to be harder for you. People are going to doubt you. They're going to test you in ways they'd never test a man. You'll have to be twice as good to get half the recognition. He'd been right, but he'd also taught her that backing down wasn't an option. If you know you belong somewhere, he'd said, then you stand your ground. You prove yourself not with words, but with actions. Sarah had carried that lesson with her through the academy, through flight school, through every deployment and assignment, and she'd carry it through this flight too. The mountains below gave way to flatter terrain. Sarah checked the navigation display. They were entering the airspace near the training range. Contact the range control, Derek instructed. Sarah keyed the radio. Range control. This is Cargo 7, approaching from the south at flight level 25, requesting clearance to enter restricted airspace. Cargo 7, range control, you are cleared to enter. Be advised, active training exercises in sectors 3 and 5. Maintain current altitude and heading. Roger, range control. Cargo 7 maintaining altitude and heading. Derek made a minor adjustment to their course. Sarah watched the GPS coordinates align with their destination. 15 minutes out. Everything was going according to plan. And then, without warning, the number 3 engine coughed. It was a small sound, barely noticeable over the general noise of the aircraft, but Sarah's trained ear caught it immediately. She glanced at the engine instruments. The temperature gauge for engine 3 was climbing, not drastically, but enough to be concerning. You see that? She asked Derek. He was already looking. Yeah, could be a sensor malfunction. Sarah watched the gauge. The temperature continued to rise. Oil pressures dropping too. Derek frowned. Run a diagnostic. Sarah's fingers flew over the controls, pulling up the engine management system. She ran through the diagnostic checklist, comparing readings, looking for anomalies. Diagnostics show a possible fuel flow issue, she reported. Recommend we reduce power to engine 3 as a precaution. Derek hesitated. Sarah could see him weighing the options. Reducing power would slow them down, potentially cause them to miss their delivery window, but ignoring a developing engine problem could lead to something much worse. It's probably nothing, Derek said. These old birds have sensor glitches all the time. Let's hold course. Sarah looked at him sharply. Sir, the temperature is still climbing. If there's a real problem, I said hold course. Captain. Derek interrupted. His voice was firm, dismissive. I've flown this plane for 5 years. I know when there's a real problem and when it's just instrument noise. Sarah bit back her argument. He was the pilot in command. Technically, the final decision was his, but every instinct she had was screaming that something was wrong. She kept her eyes on the engine read. Temperature still rising, oil pressure still falling. The numbers were moving in the wrong direction. Sir, she started. I don't need you second-guessing me, Derek snapped. Just monitor the instruments and let me fly the plane. Sarah's hands clenched into fists. This was exactly what she'd been afraid of. Derek was so determined to prove he didn't need her, so convinced she didn't know what she was talking about, that he was ignoring clear warning signs. The engine coughed again, louder this time. The plane shuddered slightly. Derek's confidence finally wavered. He looked at the temperature gauge, now deep into the yellow zone and approaching red. Damn it, he muttered. He reached for the engine controls. All right, reducing power to engine 3. But before his hand reached the throttle, there was a loud bang from the wing. The plane lurched violently to the right. Alarm bells began shrieking throughout the cockpit. The temperature gauge for engine 3 spiked into the red. Then the engine RPM dropped to 0. Engine 3 had just died, and they were still 90 miles from the nearest emergency airfield. The C-130 shook like a wild animal, the sudden loss of power on the right side throwing them into an immediate yaw. Derek grabbed the controls, fighting to keep the plane level as warning lights flooded the instrument panel in a cascade of red and amber. Engine 3 failure. Sarah called out, her voice steady despite the chaos. Her training kicked in automatically, her hands moving across the controls, shutting down fuel to engine 3, activating fire suppression. I've got the controls, Derek shouted, his earlier confidence replaced by raw tension. I'm not trying to take them, Sarah shot back. I'm managing the failed engine. That's my job. She pulled the fire suppression lever for engine 3, flooding the dead engine compartment with chemical retardant. The last thing they needed was a fire at 25,000 feet. She watched the fire detection panel. No flames, at least not yet. But the engine was completely dead. The propeller windmilling uselessly in the AIRSTREAM. Derek wrestled with the controls, trying to compensate for the asymmetric thrust. The C-130 could fly on 3 engines, but it took skill to manage, especially with a full cargo load. Declaring an emergency, Derek said, reaching for the radio, but his hand was shaking, and in his panic, he hit the wrong button. I've got it, Sarah said. She keyed the emergency frequency. Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Cargo 7. We have experienced engine failure and are declaring an in-flight emergency. The response came immediately. Cargo 7, this is range control. We copy your mayday. What is your status? Sarah checked their altitude. They were descending, slowly but steadily. Derek was fighting the controls, overcompensating, making the situation worse. Range control. Cargo 7 has lost engine 3, currently maintaining flight on 3 engines, but altitude is decreasing. We are approximately 90 miles from Edwards, bearing 2.0. Cargo 7. Nearest emergency field is Mountain View Municipal, bearing 095, 62 miles from your position. Can you make it there? Sarah pulled up the navigation display, calculating distance, rate of descent, fuel consumption. Mountain View was a small civilian airport, but it had a long enough runway to handle them. If they could stay airborne long enough to get there, stand by. Range control. She turned to Derek. We need to turn to heading 095 for Mountain View. It's our best option. Derek didn't respond. His face was pale, his knuckles white on the control yoke. He was pulling back too hard, trying to maintain altitude, but all he was doing was increasing drag and slowing their airspeed. Derek, Sarah said sharply, you're pulling back too hard. You need to ease off, or we'll stall. I know what I'm doing. Derek snapped, but his voice cracked. The airspeed indicator continued to drop. They were approaching minimum controllable airspeed. If they went below that threshold with asymmetric thrust, the plane would enter an uncontrollable spin. Sarah's mind raced. She'd trained for this scenario 100 times in the simulator. Engine failure with full cargo load. The procedure was clear. Maintain airspeed first, altitude second. A stall would kill them much faster than a gradual descent. Derek, listen to me, she said, forcing her voice to stay calm. I need you to ease forward on the yoke. We need to trade some altitude for airspeed. If we descend any faster, we won't make it to the airport. If we stall, we won't make it anywhere. Sarah countered. Trust me on this. Derek's eyes were wild with panic. For all his experience, all his combat missions, Sarah realized he'd never actually dealt with a catastrophic engine failure. He'd been lucky, and now that luck had run out, and he was freezing, just like he'd accused other pilots of doing. The stall warning horn began to blare. They were out of time. Sarah made a decision. I'm taking the controls. What? No, I have the controls, Sarah said firmly, gripping her yoke. It was a violation of protocol for a co-pilot to take command without the pilot's explicit transfer of authority, except in one situation, when the pilot was incapacitated or unable to perform their duties. Derek was still conscious, still physically capable, but mentally, he'd frozen, and Sarah wasn't going to let them die because of his pride. She pushed forward on the yoke, lowering the nose. Derek instinctively resisted, creating a dangerous tug-of-war on the controls. Let go, Derek, Sarah commanded. Let go or you'll kill us both. For a heart-stopping moment, Derek held on. Then, as the stall warning intensified and the plane began to shudder on the edge of aerodynamic collapse, his hands released the controls. Sarah immediately felt the difference. She had full authority now. She pushed the nose down further, trading precious altitude for the airspeed they desperately needed. The stall warning stopped blaring. The plane stabilized, increasing power on engines 1, 2, and 4, Sarah announced, her voice steady. She advanced the throttles on the remaining engines, carefully balancing the thrust to counteract the dead engine on the right wing. The plane was still descending, but it was under control now. Controlled flight into terrain was survivable if you had options. An uncontrolled stall was not. Sarah keyed the radio. Range control. Cargo 7, we are turning to heading 095 for Mountain View. Current altitude is 18,000 feet and descending at approximately 500 feet per minute. We will attempt landing at Mountain View. Copy that, Cargo 7. We're alerting Mountain View Tower and emergency services. You are cleared for direct approach. Any runway. Sarah checked their position. 60 miles to the airport. At their current rate of descent, they'd lose about 6,000 feet. That would put them at 12,000 feet with 50 miles to go. Tight, but doable. She turned to Derek. He was slumped in his seat, his face ashen, his hands trembling. Derek, I need you with me, Sarah said. Her voice was firm but not unkind. I know you're scared, but I need you to monitor the instruments while I fly. Can you do that? Derek didn't answer immediately. He stared at the windscreen, his breathing rapid and shallow. Derek, Sarah repeated. Can you do that? Finally, he nodded. Yeah, I can do that. Good. Call out our altitude every 1,000 feet. And watch the engine temperatures on 1, 2, and 4. We're pushing them hard. If any of them start to overheat, I need to know immediately. Understood, Derek said quietly. Sarah focused on flying. She trimmed the aircraft to maintain the delicate balance of airspeed and descent rate. Too fast and they'd overshoot the airport. Too slow and they'd stall. The margin for error was razor thin. 17,000 feet, Derek called out. Sarah adjusted the throttles slightly. The remaining engines were running hot, but still within acceptable limits. The question was whether they'd hold together long enough to get them on the ground. 16,000 feet, the mountains below were getting closer. Sarah could make out individual trees now, the shadows of clouds moving across the slopes. Beautiful and deadly. 15,000 feet. Mountain View Municipal Airport appeared on the navigation display. 40 miles out, they were going to make it. They had to make it. Sarah allowed herself one quick glance at Derek. He was doing what she'd asked. Monitoring the instruments, calling out altitudes. The panic had faded from his eyes, replaced by focus. He was a good pilot. He'd just needed someone to pull him back from the edge. 14,000 feet. The radio crackled. Cargo 7, Mountain View Tower. We have emergency equipment standing by. Winds are calm. You are cleared to land runway 18. Straighten approach. Roger. Mountain View. Sarah responded. Cargo 7 cleared to land runway 18. She could see the airport now, a small cluster of buildings and a single runway carved into the valley floor. It looked impossibly small from this altitude, but Sarah had landed in tighter spots. 13,000 feet. Sarah began configuring the aircraft for landing. Normally this would be done at a much lower altitude, but with one engine out and a heavy load, she needed to start early. Extending flaps to approach position, she announced. Flaps extending, Derek confirmed. His voice was steadier now. The plane shuddered as the flaps deployed, increasing drag and lift. Sarah compensated with the throttles, maintaining their descent profile. 12,000 feet. The runway was dead ahead, growing larger in the windscreen. Sarah calculated angles and distances automatically. A lifetime of training distilled into instinct. This was what she'd been born to do, and she wasn't going to fail. The ground rushed up to meet them, the runway centerline like a narrow ribbon cutting through the valley. Sarah's hands moved with practiced precision, making constant micro-adjustments to keep the wounded aircraft on the perfect glide path. With asymmetric thrust and a full cargo load, there would be no second chances. No go. They had one shot at this. 10,000 feet, Derek called out. His voice was almost normal now, the trained military officer reasserting himself over the panicked pilot. Engine temperatures on 1, 2, and 4 are holding. Still in the yellow, but stable. Good, Sarah replied. I'm going to need full flaps at 5,000. Call it out. Will do. The airport was clearly visible now. Sarah could see the emergency vehicles lined up along the runway, ambulances and fire trucks painted in bright red and white. She pushed the thought of what those vehicles represented out of her mind. She couldn't afford to think about worst-case scenarios. Only the task at hand. 8,000 feet. Sarah adjusted trim again. The C-130 was handling sluggishly with the dead engine, fighting her every input. But she'd learned long ago that you didn't force an aircraft. You listened to it, felt what it was trying to tell you, and worked with it. 7,000 feet. The radio crackled. Cargo 7, be advised. Slight crosswind, developing from the west at 5 knots. 5 knots wasn't much, but with one engine out on the right side, any wind from the right would push them toward the dead engine, making the asymmetry even worse. Sarah would have to account for that in her approach. 6,000 feet. Sarah scanned the instruments one more time. Airspeed good. Descent rate good. Alignment with the runway good. Everything was as perfect as it could be under the circumstances. 5,000 feet. Derek called. Ready for full flaps. Extending full flaps, Sarah announced. She moved the flap lever to the full position. The plane shuddered again as the flaps deployed fully. The descent rate increased slightly, which was expected. Sarah reduced power on the 3 working engines, balancing the new configuration. Landing gear down, she ordered. Derek reached for the gear lever. Gear down. The heavy clunk of the landing gear extending reverberated through the airframe. 3 green lights appeared on the panel, indicating all gear were down and locked. 3 greens, Derek confirmed. 4,000 feet. The runway filled the windscreen now. Sarah could see the painted numbers, the black skid marks from countless landings. She made a slight correction to the left, compensating for the crosswind. 3,000 feet. We're on glide path. Sarah's world narrowed to the runway and the instruments. Everything else fell away. This was the moment every pilot trained for but hoped never to experience. The moment where skill and luck intersected, where years of preparation met seconds of execution. 2,000 feet. The plane crossed the runway threshold. Sarah held the approach angle steady, letting the descent continue. She could feel the ground effect now, the cushion of air compressed between the wings and the earth. 1,000 feet. The touchdown zone markers flashed beneath them. Almost there. 500 feet. Sarah began the flare, pulling back gently on the yoke to transition from descent to landing. The plane's nose rose slightly, the main wheels preparing to make contact. 200 feet. The runway rushed up. Sarah held the flare, feeling for the perfect moment. 100 feet. The main wheels kissed the runway with a slight chirp. Sarah immediately deployed the thrust reversers on the 3 working engines and applied the brakes. The plane shuddered and groaned, fighting to slow its massive momentum. They were down. The C-130 rolled down the runway, gradually Sarah kept the nose wheel off the ground as long as possible to maximize aerodynamic braking, then gently lowered it. Emergency vehicles raced alongside them, matching their speed, ready to respond if anything went wrong. But Sarah maintained control, guiding the plane to a smooth stop with half the runway still remaining. For a moment, the cockpit was completely silent except for the cooling engines and their own breathing. Then Derek spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. That was incredible. Sarah's hands were shaking now, the adrenaline that she'd suppressed during the emergency finally breaking through. She gripped the yoke to steady them. Just doing my job, sir. Derek turned to look at her. His eyes were red, his face still pale, but there was something new in his expression, something that looked like respect. No, that was more than just doing your job. You saved our lives. You saved this aircraft. He paused, seeming to struggle for words. I was wrong about you. Completely wrong. Before Sarah could respond, the radio crackled. Cargo 7, excellent work. Emergency crews are approaching. Are there any injuries? Sarah keyed the mic. Negative, tower. Crew is uninjured. Aircraft is secure. Copy that. Cargo 7. Welcome to Mountain View. Sarah ran through the shutdown procedure, her hands moving automatically through the familiar checklist. Derek helped, his movements slower, still processing what had just happened. A fire truck pulled up alongside the aircraft. Through the window, Sarah could see the emergency crews checking for fuel leaks, for smoke, for any sign of ongoing danger. Finding none, the fire chief gave them a thumbs up. Sarah unstrapped from her seat. Her legs were unsteady as she stood, the physical toll of the emergency finally registering. Derek stood too, and for a moment they just looked at each other. I owe you an apology, Derek said. Actually, I owe you about 1,000 apologies. The way I treated you before the flight, during the flight, there's no excuse for it. Sarah nodded slowly. You're right, there isn't an excuse. Derek flinched but didn't look away. I let my ego and my prejudices cloud my judgment. I assumed you weren't capable because I'd already decided what I thought about female pilots. I didn't even give you a chance. He took a breath, and then when the emergency happened, I froze. Everything I thought I knew just vanished. If you hadn't been there, if you hadn't taken control, we both would have died, Sarah finished quietly. I know. I'm going to file a full report, Derek said. I'm going to recommend you for a commendation, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows that you're the reason we're standing here right now. Sarah studied his face, looking for any sign of insincerity, but Derek met her gaze steadily. He meant it. I appreciate that, Sarah said, but I need you to understand something. I didn't save us to prove a point. I didn't do it to show you or anyone else that women can fly. I did it because that's what any good pilot would have done. This isn't about my gender. It's about competence, training, commitment. I know, Derek said, or at least, I'm starting to understand. I have a lot to learn, a lot to unlearn. He extended his hand. Thank you, Captain Chen, for saving my life, and maybe for saving me from myself. Sarah shook his hand. You're welcome, Captain Hastings. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood at attention once again in a briefing room at Edwards Air Force Base. But this time, the atmosphere was completely different. The room was packed with pilots, crew chiefs, and officers. At the front stood not just Colonel Matthews, but General Patricia Rodriguez, commander of the entire Air Mobility Command. Captain Sarah Chen, General Rodriguez said, her voice carrying easily through the silent room. On the 17th of this month, you demonstrated exceptional skill, courage, and leadership under the most challenging circumstances. When faced with a catastrophic engine failure and a pilot incapacitated by stress, you took command of your aircraft and successfully executed an emergency landing that saved not only your own life and that of Captain Hastings, but also preserved a multi-million-dollar aircraft and its critical cargo. The general stepped forward, carrying a small wooden box. For your actions, you are hereby awarded the Air Medal for Heroism. Additionally, I'm pleased to inform you that you've been promoted to the rank of Major, effective immediately. Congratulations, Major Chen. The room erupted in applause. Sarah accepted the medal, the weight of it solid and real in her hand. She caught sight of Derek in the crowd. He was applauding louder than anyone, a genuine smile on his face. After the ceremony, people crowded around to congratulate her. Pilots who had previously ignored her now wanted to shake her hand. Officers who had doubted her now praised her skill. Sarah accepted their congratulations politely, but without the satisfaction she might have once expected to feel, because the truth was, she hadn't needed their validation. She'd already known what she was capable of. The medal and the promotion were nice, but they didn't define her worth. Derek approached as the crowd thinned. Congratulations, Major, well deserved. Thank you, Sarah said. How have you been? Honest answer. Humbled, Derek replied. I've been doing a lot of thinking these past few weeks. About assumptions I've made. About people I've underestimated. He paused. I've also been talking to Colonel Matthews about starting a mentorship program, pairing experienced pilots with newer ones, regardless of gender, making sure everyone gets the same opportunities to learn and grow. I was hoping you might be interested in helping set it up. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Really? Really, Derek confirmed. I can't undo the past, but maybe I can help make the future better. And I can't think of anyone better to help lead that effort than you. Sarah considered for a moment, then nodded. All right, I'm in. Derek smiled. Thank you. And Sarah, I've also put in a request for you to be my permanent co-pilot on future missions. If you're willing. Sarah couldn't help but smile. I thought you needed someone you could trust in your cockpit. I do, Derek said seriously. That's why I'm asking you. That evening, Sarah stood alone on the flight line, watching the sun set over the rows of parked aircraft. The C-130 they'd flown that day had been repaired and was already back in service. From the outside, you couldn't tell it had ever been damaged. But Sarah knew. She'd always know. Her phone buzzed. A text from her father. Saw the news about your medal. Proud doesn't begin to cover it. You proved them all wrong. Sarah smiled, but then typed back, I didn't prove them wrong, Dad. I just proved myself right. There's a difference, because that was the real lesson of that day in the sky. Sarah hadn't needed Derek's engine to fail to prove her worth. She hadn't needed a crisis or a medal or a promotion. She'd always been exactly who she was, a skilled, dedicated pilot who belonged in that cockpit. The world was finally starting to see what she'd known all along. And as the last light faded from the sky and the stars began to appear, Major Sarah Chen looked up at the vast expanse above and felt, perhaps for the first time, that she truly had arrived, not because anyone had given her permission, but because she'd never needed it in the first place. The sky had always been hers. She'd just had to claim it.